The UFO phenomena has changed over time, and I want to talk about what I would call the core UFO phenomena. You know, as much as I'm excited about Roswell, or as much as I'm intrigued by abduction reports, the core phenomena is simply people having sightings, close sightings, distant sightings, but not necessarily, you know, interacting with it as with abduction cases. Just having what you might think of as your classic UFO report, though it comes in many flavors, naturally, and many different characteristics. So how has that evolved over time? And the answer is the UFO phenomenon has not been static at all. Back in the 50s and 60s, people saw UFOs as disks. They saw it more in the daylight. UFOs were reported to land and leave traces on the ground or cause equipment to fail, whether it was cars or electrical equipment or what have you. They sometimes came very close to observers, they sometimes didn't, and they had large waves of sightings, or flaps as they were called, like 1954 in France, 1957 in the US, 1973 in the US, 1978 in Italy, and on and on. Then in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the UFO phenomena changed, and it changed rather abruptly. First, 1978 Italy, I said, that was a big wave of sightings. Well, that was the last major wave of sightings like that has occurred literally anywhere. And by that I mean isolated, but not too isolated geographically. Italy's pretty big, so we're not talking about some small, localized type thing that's over 10 or 20 or 50 square miles. So it's pretty big. Well, those kinds of things haven't gone on since then. They're with this large-scale, broad, and maybe a month or two, not 6 months, not 1 week, but a month or two of sightings. That was a classic wave. Those just stopped happening. And in fact, in the United States, there's been no such wave since 1973, but sightings have continued. So what's happened? Well, now the UFOs have evolved, I like to use the word evolve because I don't know what else to say, into having these characteristics. First, their shape is no longer as much saucer or disc-shaped, even though that is reported. Now they're triangle-shaped or boomerang-shaped. And the first instance of this that is well known was in the New York City area, of all places, in the early 1980s, the Hudson Valley boomerang cases. Very famous. Thousands of people saw this object, and the New York Times covered it even. Still unexplained, even though skeptics tried to explain this as some private pilots trying to hoax sightings. And so this went on for several years in a very isolated area. This wasn't Italy, this wasn't half of the US, this was the north of New York City and the suburbs there area, and a little bit of Connecticut. And it went on for several years. Then there was Belgium in 1989, 1990. And Belgium's not too big of a place, where once again, lots of triangles were seen, even though a few other things were also reported. In a very intense wave of sightings where the Belgian Air Force even got involved and scrambled jets, and there's a video and all the rest there. And there was a big wave in Brazil in '86. Again, wave, really a concentration like I'm describing in '86 in Brazil. And on and on. But all of these, notice the difference here is that they were more concentrated in their geographic scope and often longer in duration, not a month or two, but longer in duration than they had been before. Actually, I should say the one in Brazil was called the Night of the UFOs, and it was over a very, very short period there, which also was unlike the old waves, which went on for a long period of time. So that's changed about UFOs, how they look and how they appear. And maybe the most critical thing about it that's made it more difficult to study is that now cases with physical evidence, meaning a trace on the ground, meaning effects on the witness, physiological effects. People report like a sunburn they get if they're close to a UFO, or they feel nauseous or something. Those aren't being reported. And my favorite subject, vehicle interference cases, are also hardly being reported. We went from, what's hardly? They've dropped by about 90%, maybe 95%, which is, of course, a gigantic drop. in these kinds of reports. They never were very common, but they're really down to almost nothing now. Well, what would explain that? And let's think about that in a second, but let's carry on into this century. The people now, of course, send in lots of cell phone videos to organizations, not so much the center, but MUFON and all the rest, but we can't seem to capture any good UFOs on those cell phone videos. Not that we had lots of good UFO photos before. In fact, one of the kind of the dirty little secrets about UFOs is that we've never had great photos. The good photos have always been few and far between for whatever reason. But we certainly aren't getting any good photos now to speak of. And if we do, those videos are always of lights that are very distant. There are sometimes things that are intriguing, including in Chicago, the Tinley Park Triangle cases back in the 2004 and 2005 were very, very interesting, and I did some help there with the local MUFON guy to look into those with, again, hundreds and hundreds of witnesses. But all they were lights in the sky, and that's what shows up on the video. So UFOs have therefore become more distant. So they've changed their shape somewhat. They've changed when and how they appear. They don't appear as close to us, and they don't seem to interact with us as much. And they also don't show up with the CE3 cases, the famous phrase coined by Dr. Hynek in Steven Spielberg's movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where people report seeing entities or a creature or an alien, on the UFO or by the UFO. Those just don't seem to happen anymore either. So the phenomena has really changed over time. Do I have an explanation for that? Naturally, I don't. If I did, I would know what ultimately was causing UFOs. But what I would say is this. Think about society, think about people, think about technology, think about everything that's changed in our own country and around the world since the 1960s. Would those things have led to the changes in UFOs that I've just described? I would say no. I would say that if we'd sat back in the 60s and 70s and we'd said, well, so there's going to be an internet and there's going to be personal computers and there's going to be this and that and the other thing and all the things you can imagine, all the changes politically and so forth, well, why would those cause UFOs to change the way they behave? And I can't think of any good reason to expect that. So it seems to be independent of us, in other words. It's not witnesses causing these changes in this. It's witnesses reporting what they experience, and the experience itself has changed.